Hello and welcome. It's 10 a.m. on Thursday, the 7th of August. You're tuned in to our mid-morning newscast here on ARIRANG TV. I'm Mark Broom. Let's take a look at what's making the headlines. The Korean government will levy taxes on companies not spending enough of their profits on investment and salaries. Officials hope the move will funnel money into households and boost economic growth. The UN Human Rights Commission expresses its deep regret over Japan's failure to resolve the issue of its wartime sexual slavery. Plus, Russia bans all imports of food from the US and all fruit and vegetables from Europe in response to Western sanctions imposed over its support for pro-Moscow separatists in Ukraine. Our top story this morning is right here in Korea, however. The government says it wants to levy a 10% tax on firms that do not spend a set proportion of their corporate income on investment, salaries and dividends. The move, which requires parliamentary approval, is one of the ways the Park administration plans to stimulate the economy. Our Myung-kil reports.
The Park Geun-hye administration is proposing a tax revision, putting pressure on large conglomerates to use their cash reserves on investments, paying out dividends, and raising the wages of their employees. Instead of hoarding that cash, the government would like to see it flow into households as a way to boost domestic consumption. Under the government's proposal for a tax revision that goes into effect next year, the government will provide a 5 to 10% tax deduction for companies that raise employee salaries with extra incentives for firms that take additional measures. The dividend tax will be cut to 9% from the current 14% if dividend payouts meet certain targets. The government will impose a 10% tax on the portions of cash reserves that are deemed excessive.
We hope the companies spend their net profits on investment, salaries, and dividends.
The idea of taxing the internal reserves of companies has not been met with kindly by the business community. They contend that many of the businesses have been setting aside earnings for a rainy day. Even if companies increase their dividends to avoid taxes on their cash reserves, they say the impact would not meet expectations for increasing domestic investment and consumption. Myung-kil, ARIRANG News.
And these measures come amid another downgrade on Korea's 2014 growth forecast. The Korea Institute of Finance projects the Korean economy to grow 3.9%, which is 0.2 percentage points lower than its last estimate. The think tank cited a lower than expected recovery stemming from a slow pickup in the US and China. Slow domestic demand following April's ferry disaster was also reflected in the downward revision. The Institute also changed its stance on keeping the interest rate frozen and said further monetary easing is an option this time. The Bank of Korea holds its rate meeting for August next Thursday. Global smartphone leaders Samsung and Apple have been at each other's throats in courtrooms around the world for about 3 years now, accusing each other of infringing on their patents. But on Wednesday, the two announced a partial truce. Our Park Geun-hye has the details.
Samsung and Apple agreed to drop all litigation cases between them in all countries, except for in the United States. That means some 30 lawsuits will be dropped in courts in 8 countries, including Korea, Japan, Germany, and France. However, the joint statement released Wednesday says the agreement does not cover any cross-licensing arrangements between the two smartphone rivals. The lawsuits between the world's 2 biggest smartphone makers began in 2011 when Apple sued Samsung for copying iPhone features. Samsung responded by countersuing Apple for infringing its wireless transmission technology. The patent trials have since spread to courts around the globe. The mutual rapprochement began in May when Samsung and Apple agreed to drop lawsuits related to Motorola mobility. 1 month later, they agreed to dismiss their appeals of a patent case at the U.S. International Trade Commission. This week's agreement leaves just 2 cases pending in the U.S., both currently in the appeals process. In May, a jury ordered Samsung to pay Apple some $120 million in damages. It also ordered Apple to pay some $160,000 to Samsung for patent infringements. In a separate case in a U.S. court in 2012, a jury verdict ordered Samsung to pay Apple $930 million. Both cases are currently being appealed. Park Geun-hye, ARIRANG News.
Now, there's been a recent slowdown of exports from Korea to China, and this is setting alarm bells off for trade officials here in Seoul, as China is by far and away Korea's biggest trading partner. But some analysts say the crisis could actually serve as an opportunity for some. Our Kim Ji-yeon tells us who.
The rate of increase in Korea's exports to China is slowing as local Chinese companies are producing cheaper products. Up until now, a majority of Korean exports to China were in the form of intermediate trade, goods in which the product is reprocessed and consumed in the import country. Steel, machinery, and petrochemicals fall in that category, and it's why analysts like Lee Bong-gul from the Korea International Trade Association have emphasized the need to diversify the country's exports to shift the focus toward consumer goods or products that can be purchased for use by the average Chinese consumer.
We have to look closely into the recent growth policies and paradigm shifts made by the Chinese government. In the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008, Beijing is trying to develop its domestic market to boost consumption rather than becoming a big factory for exports.
027 Incorporated, a Korean clothing manufacturer for toddlers, is an example of one company that's taking advantage of Beijing's growth policies. It has sales of around $236 million last year and is currently doing business with more than 200 stores across China.
We expect the demand for baby products to increase in China as the government gradually relaxes its one-child policy.
Consumer goods to China from January to May this year increased more than 9% compared to the same period last year, promising signs for Korean industries who are trying to survive in the increasingly competitive global market. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
Now, Korea's National Assembly is holding a confirmation hearing on this Thursday morning for President Park's Education Minister nominee Hwang Woo-ya. The 66-year-old former judge, former ruling party leader and 5-term lawmaker is one of the president's closest aides. He was tapped as education chief after the previous candidate, Kim Myung-soo, dropped out about a month ago due to allegations of plagiarism. While the ruling Saenuri party says the confirmation hearing needs to focus purely on Hwang's qualifications as education chief, opposition camps aim to delve deep into Hwang's records and also his perspectives on history. Now, President Park Geun-hye has emphasized the importance of education in regards to character development as the country continues to reel from some really rather shocking bullying scandals that have hit the army. Chairing a meeting of the Presidential Committee for Cultural Enrichment in Seoul on Wednesday, the president said culture building is a fundamental way to tackle current social issues such as bullying and violence at schools and in military barracks. And in a related development, the army is launching a special task force on reforming Korea's military culture. The task force will consist of officers, government officials and civilian experts, and they aim to come up with a plan to combat bullying in the military by the end of this year.
Said that a team of South Korea...
Get connected to Korea and the world. Join us every weekday for the latest developments out of Korea, Asia, and beyond. On air, on your mobile, and online, we lead the way every day. ARIRANG News.
To try and resolve the crisis in Ukraine, the European Union also offers €15 billion. Now, there's word out of Washington that the United States and South Korea have agreed that US wartime operational control over the South Korean military should be extended by another 5 years. This from the current 2015 to 2020. Now, sources at a high-level defense meeting between the two say the allies believe Seoul needs more time to become fully capable of deterring North Korea's military threats. Our Yulian has this report.
Talks on transferring the wartime operational control of South Korean forces from Washington to Seoul are underway, and it looks like the transfer will be delayed by 5 years to 2020. Delegations led by Korea's Deputy Defense Minister Ryu Jae-seung and U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia David Helvey are currently in Washington to discuss the appropriate timing. Sources there say they agree South Korea's military needs more time to bolster its defense and other capabilities to counter threats posed by North Korea. This meeting is crucial as it could be the last round of talks before the two allies announce their agreement at their annual defense ministerial meeting in Washington in October. The U.S. took control of South Korean forces during the Korean War back in the early 1950s. Peacetime control was returned in 1994, and the South Korean military is set to achieve full autonomy next year if it takes over wartime operational control as previously scheduled. But following Pyongyang's third nuclear test in February last year, Seoul had asked Washington to delay the transfer. South Korea's defense minister Han Min-gu has also been pointing to the changing circumstances behind Seoul's request, emphasizing that North Korea has been carrying out realistic drills since Kim Jong-un took power in 2012. Yurian, ARIRANG News.
Now, there's been another high-profile voice speaking up on Japan's lack of repentance for its past wrongdoings. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has harshly criticized Japan's approach to the issue of its wartime sexual slavery. In a statement Wednesday, Navi Pillay said that Tokyo has failed to pursue a comprehensive, impartial and lasting resolution for the elderly surviving victims of its wartime atrocities. She added that the women's rights continue to be violated to this day, as the rights of the victims to justice and reparation are still not realized. She also said it pains her to see that the victims are passing away one by one without having their rights restored. The Korean government is also urging Japan to sincerely reflect upon and take responsible measures to resolve the matter. Turning now to the latest on the Ebola outbreak, and it seems Saudi Arabia will be the first country to confirm an Ebola case outside of West Africa as the death toll ticks up to over 930 people. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Health says a 40-year-old Saudi man suspected of having contracted the Ebola virus during a recent business trip to Sierra Leone died on Wednesday at a hospital in Jeddah. The ministry says it has submitted samples from the man to US and German laboratories for testing. Meanwhile, Liberia's president has declared a state of emergency in the West African nation as the Ebola outbreak there shows no signs of slowing, with over 280 deaths there alone. Speaking on national TV late Wednesday local time, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf said that some civil rights may have to be suspended as a result of the crisis. Time now for a look at some of the other international headlines we're following on this Thursday morning. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim standing by at the News Centre. Very good morning to you, Eunice.
Hello, Mark.
Now, it looks like the Ukraine crisis could now start to affect farmers and producers in the West as Russia is poised to close its market to countries that impose sanctions on it.
Right, and of course we're talking about the U.S. and EU nations, and it could have substantial impact on European farmers in particular, as Moscow is the biggest buyer of their fruits and vegetables. Our Kwon So-ah has the details.
Responding to the tougher economic sanctions recently imposed on Russia by the EU and the US, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a one-year ban of agricultural produce, food and vegetable imports on nations that have imposed sanctions against Russia. The government has been ordered to come up with a specific list of goods. Russia's move will have a big impact on Western exporters as Russia imports nearly a third of its fruit products from the EU, and the US is its second biggest poultry importer. In an attempt to lessen the impact on domestic consumers, Russian authorities say they're looking for alternative partners. Talks with Argentina, Ecuador and Brazil are already scheduled for this week. Earlier, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev reportedly said Moscow was considering banning European airlines from flying to Asia over Siberia. The sanctions against Russia began with Russia's annexation of Crimea in March, but were strengthened last week, now targeting Russia's defense, financial, and oil sectors. This came in response to Russia's continuous support for pro-Moscow separatists in Ukraine.
We don't know yet whether sanctions are working. Sanctions are working as intended in putting enormous pressure and strain on the Russian economy. If you look at projections for Russian growth, what you're seeing is that the economy has ground to a halt.
Meanwhile, there are concerns Russia could be planning an invasion, as Moscow is believed to have massed some 20,000 combat-ready troops at its border with Ukraine. NATO says Moscow could go in on the pretext of a humanitarian or peacekeeping mission as Kiev gains ground on separatist-held territory. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
And on the ground in Gaza, the 72-hour ceasefire is holding for a second day, while representatives from Israel and Palestine are engaged in indirect talks to reach a longer-term truce. The negotiations are taking place in Cairo via Egyptian mediators, a process expected to be long and hard. Palestinians are calling for an end to Israel and Egypt's blockade of the Gaza Strip that disallows commodities, individuals in and out of the region, dealing a heavy blow to the region's economy. Israel wants Hamas to disarm completely. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blamed the high civilian death toll in the conflict on Hamas, which he said had used residents as human shields. Meanwhile, the United Nations says more than 500,000 Gaza residents were displaced in the battered Gaza Strip. That's about 29% of the territory's inhabitants. Rescue operations continue in China's southwest, and a miracle of sorts. An 88-year-old woman was saved out of the rubble from Sunday's devastating earthquake. Xiong Zingfen was buried for some 50 hours before being found on Tuesday in Babao village, near the epicenter of the magnitude 6.1 quake in Yunnan province. Doctors said her vital signs were normal. China's Xinhua news agency also reported another senior resident rescue. The 76-year-old is also said to be in stable condition. Hundreds of others were not so fortunate. An additional 179 people were confirmed killed on Wednesday, bringing the death toll from the quake to 589. And in a first in space history, a European spacecraft dubbed Rosetta has successfully caught up with a flying comet following a 10-year chase. A 6.5-minute thruster burn brought Rosetta into, quote, orbit with the comet and will begin mapping its surface in detail. The hope is that the study of the comet, which has some of the oldest materials in the universe, will reveal clues to the origins of the solar system, its planets, and life itself.
And a good Thursday morning to you all as we kick things off with, you guessed it, the ongoing search for the next head coach of the South Korean national football team. But this time, there will be an update on the issue as Lee Young-soo, the head of the technical committee who is over in the Netherlands, will update the press on the current search. Now, Lee, who is reported to be in the Netherlands to speak with Bert van Marwijk in order to convince him to accept the position as the head coach of the national team, will update everyone on the negotiations. Now, reports say that the technical committee director will either state whether or not Van Marwijk accepted his offer and/or talk about his plans if the offer was declined. With the September A matches about a month away now, the KFA will speed up their process in the search for the next head coach. And staying with football, but over to the U20 Women's World Cup currently taking place in Canada. And with North Korea beating Finland 2-1 in their first match, South Korea went up against England in their first match. Now, Group C kicks off with Korea hoping to repeat their performance from 4 years ago, and they get a great start as Lee So-dam converts a spot kick in the 15th minute of the match for an early 1-0 lead. In the second half, England levels the match with a goal from Martha Harris as the match ends in a 1-1 draw. And now with that, moving over to some Wednesday night's KBO action. 2 of the games on the night were canceled due to rain, but the NC Dinos won their first game of their doubleheader 3-1 before the Lotte Giants won the second game 10-4. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the first place Samsung Lions take on the last place Hanwha Eagles. And of course, going into the game here, third inning of the game, Kim Sang-soo leading off the inning, and there it goes to deep left, back, gone, and it's 1-0 Samsung before Park Geun-hye makes it 2-0 with an RBI single to right. But the 6th inning of the game, Kim Tae-gyun at bat, and there it goes, drilled to deep right, gone, and it's now 2-1. 9th inning, Cho In-sung at bat, and there it goes, and we're tied 2-2. 11th inning of the game, Chung Gun-woo with a man on, and this ball is driven to deep center field. Gone, ball game over. The Hanwha Eagles win this one on a walk-off, 4-2. And now staying with domestic baseball. Now, after the LA Dodgers successfully brought over Lee Hyun-jin from the KBO, there's been a ton of MLB scouts watching the KBO for more talent. But recently, it's Kang Jong-ho of the Nexen Heroes who's garnering a ton of attention from the scouts. Now, the 27-year-old slugger, who's currently set a league record for the most home runs in a single season for a shortstop with 31, has been the biggest interest among the MLB scouts. Now, the Nexen slugger is a rare talent since it's hard to find a good defensive shortstop with power. Now, amongst the MLB teams, the St. Louis Cardinals have been aggressively scouting him, even videotaping all of his games as well. And now finishing things off in tennis, where Serena Williams made history after being ranked #1 in the world for the 200th week. Now, the American, who has been one of the most dominating players in the past decade, became just the 5th player in history to claim the #1 spot for the 200th week. Now, the 17-time Grand Slam winner first held the top ranking back in 2002. And that's going to wrap it up for me. This has been SJ. Have a great rest of the day, and see you guys again for your sports needs.
Good morning. It's 입추 today, according to a solar term, which means the beginning of the autumn. Also, it's the last day of the 3 hottest days, 말복, here in Korea. But readings in most areas are expected to hover below 30 degrees Celsius, thanks to lots of clouds and nationwide showers. So it's just gonna be a sprinkle here in Seoul, but East Coast regions will receive heavy showers at times as the 20 to 60 millimeters of rainfall is expected. With that, here are the readings for today. The high in Seoul, Daegu, and Busan will rise to 29, while Gwangju will have a daily highs of 30. And for other regions, it looks like Jeju Island and Daejeon will top out at 30 and 27 respectively, while Dokdo should see highs of 24. And giving you an update on the path of Typhoon Halong, well, typhoon continues moving to northeast, heading to the mainland Japan. So strong gusty winds and high waves are in store for Jeju, southern coast, and the east coast areas, as they will be indirectly affected by Halong over the weekend. So if you have planned to spend your vacation in those areas for next few days, please stay alert. Now that's all for Korea, and here's the international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, that's all we have for now, but we'll be back at noon Korea time in about 90 minutes. Until then, goodbye.